This is Christopher Young, and this is Gotham and the Sacred. We live in a strange moment. By almost every measure, belief in God remains widespread. Churches still stand, sacred language still circulates, moral claims are made constantly. And yet, something has collapsed. Not belief, but authority. Not faith, but function. This is Gotham and the Sacred. This is a podcast about philosophy, theology, ethics, and government, and about what happens when the sacred survives only as sentiment, but no longer orders our lives, restrains our power, or binds us one to another. This season, we explore a condition we call functional fatality, a world in which God is still spoken of, but no longer obeyed. God is invoked, but not feared, consumed, but not authoritative. We will ask uncomfortable questions. Can democracy survive without moral limits it did not create? Does capitalism depend on virtues it quietly erodes? Why do institutions fail when belief remains strong? And what replaces the sacred when it no longer binds? This is not a podcast about nostalgia or history. It is not a cultural war, and it is not easy answers. It is a serious conversation for a serious age. Welcome to Gotham and the Sacred. This is episode 4, Classical and Medieval Moral Order, when freedom had a shape. Modern societies begin moral reasoning with a quiet assumption that the individual is the starting point. Morality emerges from choice. Obligation follows consent, and freedom means the absence of restraint. But for most of Western history, from Aristotle to the Old Testament prophets, from Christ to St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, morality did not begin with choice. Morality began with order. Morality began with purpose. It began and was traced to the sacred. Today we trace that moral architecture and asks, what happens when freedom loses the sacred shape that it once gave meaning? Let's begin with Aristotle. The philosopher Aristotle begins not with autonomy, but with something he calls telos, or purpose. According to Aristotle, everything in nature has an end or a purpose. For instance, an acorn becomes an oak. A knife cuts. A musician plays music in tune. Likewise, a human being flourishes, fulfills their purpose through virtue. Those virtues are grounded in morality. Aristotle recognizes many virtues. For instance, courage, temperament, justice, or prudence. These are not social inventions. They are excellences rooted in human nature. Morality then is not discovered. It's constructed. For Aristotle, morality is not constructed, it is discovered. Freedom is not the ability to choose anything whatsoever. According to Aristotle, it is the disciplined capacity to pursue what fills our nature or our purpose. Already we see something radically different between Aristotle and the modern assumptions. According to the pre-modern ideas, such as those from Aristotle, freedom is meaningful only because reality is ordered. Yet Aristotle leaves open the door to a deeper question. What anchors that meaning? What anchors morality? The Hebrew prophets answer this question quite well. The Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament argue for morality as something different than philosophical speculation. They proclaim morality is a divine command. Consider one of the sacred prophets, or the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah. Isaiah writes, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." This is not moral relativism, as we often associate with modern thinkers and contemporary society. Isaiah's thoughts are a declaration that moral categories are objective because they are grounded in God's holiness. The prophet Amos cried out, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." To Amos, justice is not pragmatic policy, it is sacred obligation. Consider the words of the prophet Micah, who writes, "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God?" Notice the structure there. Justice flows from walking with God. Morality is covenantal. It reflects divine character. When Israel turns to idols, we see in the Old Testament that injustice follows. When sacred allegiance shifts away from God, social order fractures. The prophets readily warn. Moral decay begins with misplaced worship. A society becomes unjust when it worships the wrong God. We see furtherance of these thoughts through Christ. Christ enters this prophetic tradition, not to dismantle what was recognized in the Old Testament, but to fulfill it. "You have heard it said, but I say to you," said Christ. External compliance is no longer sufficient. Anger is moral failure. Lust is moral disorder. Hypocrisy is corruption of the heart. See, Christ interiorizes morality. He grounds it in the highest sacred command. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind." Accordingly to Christ, only then you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I'm going to repeat. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and only then you shall love your neighbor as yourself. See, the sacred was a requirement in order for you to gain that love. The second command rests upon the first. Love your neighbor as yourself is ultimately grounded in understanding and knowing God. Christ also redefines freedom. Whoever commits sin is a slave to sin. See, freedom is not self-expression in this instance. It is liberation from disordered desire. We read also in the New Testament through Christ that truth sets you free. Truth is not constructed, however, it's revealed. We see other philosophers and theologians who further support the notions of Christ and those of earlier philosophers such as Aristotle. Take, for instance, St. Augustine of Hippo, who deepens this insight. Augustine suggests that human beings are lovers before they are thinkers. Sin, according to Augustine, is not simply rule-breaking. It is misdirected love. In the city of God, Augustine describes two communities: the city of God, built on love of God, and the city of man, built on the love of man, or the love of self. Accordingly, every civilization is shaped by ultimate allegiance. If society loves power above God, power becomes its morality. If it loves wealth above God, wealth becomes its measure. Therefore, freedom without rightly ordered love becomes bondage to appetite. Augustine's warnings here echo the prophets. Idolatry produces injustice. Disordered worship produces disordered society. We can further the ideas of Augustine by looking at Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas actually unites Aristotle and Augustine. This is what Aquinas suggests. He suggests that natural law is participation or participates in eternal law, in divine reason itself. Human beings are inclined toward life, truth, community, God. These inclinations are not arbitrary. According to Aquinas, they reflect the Creator's design. Human law is legitimate only when it aligns with the higher order. An unjust law, therefore, is not a true law. This is revolutionary. It means political power is not ultimate. According to Aquinas, the sacred stands above the state. The sacred stands above law. Therefore, morality is intelligible because it reflects divine reason. Freedom is meaningful because it aligns with divine purpose. We see this even from modern thinkers who observe the same exact patterns. Take, for instance, the sociologist Emile Durkheim, who noted that societies inevitably distinguish between the sacred and the profane. According to Durkheim, the sacred binds the community. Without the sacred, moral fragmentation, what he calls animi, emerges. Another philosopher, Alasdair MacIntyre argues that modern moral discourse is fractured because it has lost its sacred or shared teleology. He says that we debate justice without agreement above human purpose. Simply, MacIntyre is agreeing with Nietzsche and some of the others, that when we lose our ability, or we lose our shared agreement with the sacred, we lose our ability to have a shared human purpose. Therefore, we lose our ability to have a just society. To bring back Nietzsche, he warned that once belief in God collapses, moral values lose their anchor. Across disciplines such as theology, philosophy, sociology, the pattern converges continuously. Morality requires something ultimate. Morality requires something outside of the rational. It requires the irrational. It requires something that stands above all of it. This is what we're referring to as the sacred order God. In the classical philosophical and biblical moral order, freedom indeed had its shape. For Aristotle, freedom was excellence. For Isaiah, Old Testament prophets Isaiah and Amos and Micah, freedom was covenantal holiness. For Christ, freedom was love of God. For Augustine, freedom was rightly ordered love. For Aquinas, freedom was participation in divine reason. But what's important with all of them is that freedom was not infinite, self-defined, meaning the individual did not choose what these freedoms were or these successes were. All of these freedoms, all of these successes were oriented toward the highest good, the God. Take, for instance, this notion that a river without riverbanks does not become freer. I'll say that again. A river, a flowing river without riverbanks does not become freer. It becomes destructive because the water is displaced and nobody has benefit of it. Therefore, when sacred structure dissolves, when these laws and these frameworks and these historical rules dissolve, freedom loses its coherence, like the river without riverbanks. Therefore, when freedom loses coherence, power fills the vacuum. This brings us to what I call the modern reversal. Modernity relocates or has relocated moral authority from the sacred to the elite, from transcendence to autonomy. It's also, we see this in most contemporary society, is that modernity relocated morality from a God and the sacred to the elites, now to the individual personal will. No longer do we pursue virtues and rules and definitions as we have in the past. What we now have is we have rights replacing virtues. We have legal consent replacing covenant. Yet the moral vocabulary remains the same as it did 200, 500, and 1500 years ago. That moral vocabulary is justice, dignity, and equality. As I already mentioned, historically these words were grounded in belief that humans bared based upon a divine image, meaning they were grounded in a divine. But when we remove that sacred grounding and the language persists, the foundation of that language shifts. Consensus now becomes fragile. Power now becomes decisive. Across everybody I discussed today, Aristotle, the prophets, Christ, Augustine, Aquinas, a unified insight emerges. Morality is not self-generated. It is participation in a sacred order. Freedom is meaningful because it is oriented toward that order. The modern experiment asks whether morality can survive after severing its sacred roots. History is now testing that question. If morality is grounded in the sacred, then the erosion of the sacred is not merely a private spiritual shift. It is a civilization turning point. And in the next episode, I will examine the moment when Western thought attempted to secure peace by hollowing out sacred authority, and how that decision permanently reshaped freedom itself. Lots for us to think about. This is Gotham and the Sacred.